palestra está concorrida, pelo que eu estou vendo, então tem gente ainda entrando. A gente está só esperando mais um pouquinho, os que estão lá fora, mas eu vou já começando aqui nosso painel. Meu nome é Marcelo Moreira, eu sou conselheiro da Abraji. Eu vou conduzir essa entrevista, muito feliz de vocês estarem aqui e muito feliz em ter aqui a repórter Nicole Hannah Jones. Nicole Hannah Jones hoje trabalha no NYTimes, ela é uma repórter investigativa e ela tem no currículo dela a cobertura do tema da igualdade racial nos Estados Unidos, um tema que é muito recorrente nos Estados Unidos e que não é tão recorrente aqui na nossa mídia. Então a gente vai falar um pouco sobre a cobertura de raça e também sobre a cobertura de gênero. A Nicole tem 15 anos de profissão, nasceu em Waterloo, estado de Iowa. Eu entrevistei ela mais cedo, então só para ver se minha memória está boa. E ela tem 15 anos de profissão, ela começou em jornais pequenos, em North Carolina, no Oregon. Depois ela passou pelo ProPublica. E how long have you been in the New York Times? E há 3 anos e meio ela está no New York Times. É uma jornalista premiada. Ela não ganhou o Pulitzer ainda, eu diria, mas ela ganhou vários outros prêmios nos Estados Unidos famosos, como o Peabody, o National Magazine, George Polk. E no ano passado ela foi consagrada com um dos maiores prêmios, que não é só para a área do jornalismo nos Estados Unidos, que é o MacArthur Genius Award. Para quem não sabe, é um prêmio de $625 mil que eles dão anualmente para 24 áreas, e ela foi escolhida na área do jornalismo. E podemos dizer aqui que nós temos na nossa frente uma gênia no jornalismo. Genius. I'm telling that you're genius. E ela falou que é verdade. E ela também, eu já assisti algumas entrevistas que ela deu, colegas jornalistas e que gostam e que curtem ela, chamam a Nicole de rainha do jornalismo investigativo nos Estados Unidos. Então, com vocês, Nicole Hannah Jones. Eu vou falar inglês e tem tradução, e se vocês não entenderem... Não, ela precisa entender meu inglês, né? Então, acho que vai dar certo. Okay, Nicole. Okay, maybe we should start you talking a little bit about you when you were born and when you decided to be a journalist. I heard the story that when you were at the high school and then you talked to a teacher because you didn't like the coverage that your local, not the local, but the paper in your high school, they did talk about racial issues. Can you talk us a little bit about it? Your beginning and this high school part?
Yes. First of all, I just want to thank Abraji for bringing me to Brazil. This is my first time in your wonderful country. I've long wanted to visit, so I'm very grateful to be here. Also, I was told that y'all don't really like to talk about race, but I can't tell today. So that's good that there are a lot of people in the audience to have a discussion about this issue. And I actually just have a question. In America, we are very blunt. So I'm just going to ask a blunt question. How many people in here would identify as black?
That's good. That's good. We have...
Okay. This so far is the most black people I've seen since I've gotten here, but I also understand a bit about the racial politics of Brazil, so I'm just curious as to how many people would actually self-identify that way. So I grew up in the Midwest in the United States and was always very nerdy. I know it's hard to tell because I'm very fabulous now. But I was a very nerdy child. I always loved to read news and I loved to read history. And from a young age, I saw that the way that black communities were portrayed in the media was not the way that I saw. It wasn't true. It was not reflective of the people I knew in my communities and the people that I knew in my own family. And so I think I wrote my first letter to the editor, to our local newspaper about something that had been written about someone in the black community when I was in 5th grade. So from a young age, I understood the power of the media to lead perceptions of marginalized communities. So in the United States, when school segregation was struck down, many communities were forced to integrate schools by busing black kids into white schools. And starting in second grade, I was part of a program where we were bused out of our black neighborhood into white schools. And so I went to a majority white high school that was not in my neighborhood, but in a white neighborhood. And I was taking a Black Studies class, and I complained to that teacher that our newspaper never wrote about kids like me who were black kids bused into this white high school. And he said, if you don't like it, join the newspaper or shut up and don't complain about it anymore. So that's what I did. I joined the paper. My very first column was about whether Jesus was black.
Is he black?
This is my first big investigation, was whether Jesus was black. And,
so what did you find out?
Well, I could not prove definitively that he was black, but I could prove that he wasn't white, which was really the point in the first place. So that's where I won my very first journalism award as a high school student. And it was then that I think I really became hooked on understanding the power of telling your own stories, that when you are a marginalized, a member of a marginalized community, you cannot allow other people to only tell your stories, that you have to be amongst those who are telling the stories, because that is the only way you get an accurate portrayal of what these communities are actually like.
So all over your career, you are committed to this issue specifically. So you prefer and you are allowed to do that. Did you have problems? Did you have problems?
Of course.
You can start with the small newspapers, and when you were beginning, and then when you really did the first story that your name appeared on the front pages of the papers or websites or whatever.
Okay. So I had a very traditional journalism career. I started at a small weekly newspaper. I worked there for a few months. Then I got hired at a smaller regional daily paper, and then I moved from that daily paper to a larger daily paper, and then from there to ProPublica, hey Steve, in New York, where I began working as an investigative reporter, and then to the New York Times. I can say my very first job was covering public schools in a majority black city that where the schools were very segregated. And so my first job, I was writing about school inequality, the impacts of school segregation on black children, and at that paper, they loved that. I had a harder time in other parts of my career where editors discouraged me from writing about race. A lot of times in the United States, the assumption is black reporters who want to write about race are biased, that we can't tell these stories in an objective way.
So you mean that editors prefer white people to write about race than black?
I think there are two issues. I think some editors prefer you don't write about race that much at all. And I also think that there is a sense that white reporters are objective when it comes to race, and black journalists are not objective. Of course, I dispute that. If you grow up as a white person in a white dominant society built on slavery, then of course you have a stake in whiteness, and I think that those journalists are also not objective when it comes to race. But that is the assumption. And then there were times in my career where I was allowed to do exactly the type of reporting that I wanted to do, which when I went to ProPublica, I was able to spend sometimes an entire year on one project on racial inequality, and that's what I do at the Times.
So, só uma coisa. A última meia hora a gente vai abrir para perguntas, mas como a gente está com poucos microfones, então a gente vai fazer as perguntas por escrito, e aí vocês podem encaminhar as perguntas para as nossos voluntários que estão aqui, e aí eu vou, no final, vou encaminhando e vou perguntando para Nicole. But so, your first story that you really are proud of written, or the story that your name was there, so that people knew you were Nicole. You were...
So those are two different questions. I did a lot of work that I was really proud of when no one knew who I was, which is how most journalists work for most of their lives, is people don't widely know most of us who do this work. I was writing about black children who were being suspended from schools at much higher rates. Some schools were suspending 1/4 of their black kids in elementary school. I was very proud of those types of stories. I was very proud of a story I did where within one school, there were 2 schools, one school for within the same building, one for black kids, one for white kids, and the school with black kids didn't get any of the same classes that the school for white kids got, and those kids knew that, and they were ashamed by that. And when I did that story, suddenly everyone who had created that school acted very surprised that it existed and got rid of it. So those types of stories I'm very proud of, but I think the work my work started to get more nationally known was my work on housing and school segregation, where I was taking these very intractable structural issues that many journalists had stopped writing about because they were such a part of our society, and I think something that we had given up on in terms of investigating, and I've made it my job to show that the segregation we see today is still very intentional. I would say often illegal.
So
and that it's
you
a
would
way
say
that you can,
housing
yes,
and school segregation are related?
Of course, right, because in the U.S., as in probably here, you're zoned to the school that's closest to you. So you attend a school in your neighborhood, and if your neighborhoods are segregated, then your schools will be segregated. But also, people buy homes in neighborhoods depending on what schools serve those neighborhoods. So they drive each other. If you have an all-black neighborhood school, then an all-poor neighborhood school, then wealthier white people won't move into that neighborhood because they don't want their children to go to that school. So they drive each other, and they just work to really drive inequality. And I think housing in schools explains a large deal of the inequality that black Americans still face.
And then you went to the Times.
Yes.
So how did it happen, and what's your work there? What do you normally do working in the New York Times?
You know, it's probably hard to believe for most journalists. I never aspired to work at the New York Times. I didn't dream that high, honestly. I come from a very working class family. My father was born into a poor sharecropping family in Mississippi, which is the poorest state in the United States. I just wanted to work at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution and write about black folks in the South, and they never hired me. That's okay, though. I did okay.
You still have time.
Yeah, maybe one day they'll hire me. But I got a call one day from the Times, and they asked me to come in and offer me a job that I could not resist taking, which was to write long-form investigative pieces for the magazine. But I never applied. I just didn't dream that I would get a job there, so it wasn't even something I was looking for.
So what is being a journalist and being black? Do you see many black journalists in America's newsrooms? And do you see any difference being a black journalist or not being black journalists in America?
Yeah, of course.
News outlets?
Our newsrooms in the United States, just like here, as I have seen at this conference, are not representative of the demographics of our country. Overall, our newsrooms are approximately 85% white. I'm talking about print media. Broadcast media is a little more diverse, so television is more diverse than print, and radio is also not very diverse. But we are a country that is only, a little more than 60% white, but our newsrooms are overwhelmingly white. I think that is clearly a problem, because that means that there are stories that just don't get told because the people who are writing the news are not connected to those communities. They don't live in those communities. They don't often believe that the stories are important. A good example, I think, is a lot of you probably heard of the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States, which comes about because black people were being killed, unarmed black people were being killed by police. This was not a new thing. This has been happening since there have been police in the United States. They have been disproportionately violent to black Americans. I don't know a black reporter who didn't know that this was happening, but most mainstream media was not writing about this. And it was only because of social media, where individual citizens were videotaping these police incidents and posting them online and totally subverting mainstream media, that mainstream media was forced to start covering the killings of unarmed black people. So I think that is the problem, is that newsrooms that are not diverse have too many blind spots, and when they do cover communities of color, they get it wrong a lot. So they write about our communities in ways that are stereotypical. They don't write about us in ways that show our full humanity. We get covered for crime and sports, but not because we're astrophysicists, right? And I think that is the fundamental problem in American media. In the 1960s, as we were going through the civil rights movement, and in northern parts of the United States, there were more than 100 riots. The President of the United States at that time commissioned a study called the Kerner Commission Report to find out why as we were expanding civil rights for black Americans, were northern black people rioting. And one of the key components that they found was the media, that mainstream media was too white, and because of that, they were ignoring the plight of black people who were living in urban ghetto communities. And so they were caught unsurprised when these communities rioted. I would say we still have that same problem today.
Okay, but although you don't have many black journalists in the newsrooms, you have an association of black journalists, the National Association of Black Journalists. And you have black journalists since a long time ago. I would say about Ida B. Wells. So Ida B. Wells was a black journalist. Can you tell us about her and a little bit about what does the work of the Association for Black Journalists does and the importance for the covering of race in American press? Sure.
Is there a tradition here of black journalists or black newspapers?
Yes or no? Yes. We have in Brazil. In Brazil. Jornais que se declaram jornais de cobertura.
Existem dois, Mundo Negro e Alma Preta. Eu conheço este.
Okay, a few.
Yes.
Mais alternativo.
Okay.
Alternative, yeah.
So I think in this way, the black American experience is quite different. There has been black newspapers, black-owned newspapers who were reporting on the black experience in the United States since the 1800s. The very first one was called the Freedom's Journal. And the motto of that newspaper was, we wish to tell our own stories, too long have others spoken for us. So I think there's long been a recognition in the United States among black people that having a newspaper and being able to report your own stories, particularly in the time before black people had full legal citizenship rights, was very critical. And this was true all the way until the civil rights movement, because most mainstream newspapers did not hire black journalists at all. And what happened during the civil rights movement, most white newspapers didn't even cover the civil rights movement at first. It was only black newspapers who were covering it. And when the riots started to happen, newspapers were all white. They did not have reporters they could send into the riot areas, because if you sent a white reporter into the riot areas, sometimes that reporter might be physically abused. So many of the first black reporters were hired into white newsrooms during the riots, because they understood how important it was to have people who looked like and came from the communities that were rioting. So in that same period is when a group of black journalists came together and created an organization called the National Association of Black Journalists. And this would have been in the 1970s. So they just had a few years ago the 40th anniversary, and it was the understanding that black journalists face particular difficulties in working in white newsrooms, in having the support to do the type of work that they wanted to do in white newsrooms, and also to try to push white newsrooms to do a better job of covering black communities and providing opportunities for black journalists. So we're actually one of the largest journalism organizations in the United States. We have our conventions, until recently, were the largest conventions. Every year there is a convention where more than 2,000 black journalists come into one city to get trained and party.
Which is good. You should not only work.
You know, it can be a very isolating experience. If you're not at a large newsroom, you may be one of only 1 or 2 or 3 black journalists in your newsroom, and that can be very challenging because as much as we would like to pretend that we do not have a problem with racism in the United States, and particularly in newsrooms where people tend to think that they are more progressive, there's still a lot of prejudice, a lot of stereotyping that happens in newsrooms, and it can still be very hard to advance and to be able to do the bigger projects that black journalists want to do.
So in black papers, people that work there, they are all black? Because in considered traditional media, you have black people working. So is there any policy that you hire only black journalists in a black paper?
No. So this was the time when you had a lot of black newspapers was when there was still legal apartheid in the United States, and so you could not work in a white newsroom because you would not be hired. So the black press existed because you could not work in what would be called mainstream press, which I would call the white press. What happens after the civil rights movement is many of the best black journalists went into white newsrooms, and suddenly those black newspapers many of them began to close because there was not the support in the communities. You didn't need them as much because there were black people working in newsrooms who could tell those stories in mainstream papers. So I think there are no daily black newspapers anymore. There are some weeklies, but most of the black press is gone now. But let's just be clear. There was never a time in America where black institutions did not allow white people into those institutions. Black institutions were created because black people were not allowed into white institutions. So white institutions barred black people. Black institutions have never barred white people.
And tell us a little bit about Ida B. Wells. Who was she? What was her importance for American journalism?
Sure. So if you're on Twitter, my Twitter handle is Ida Bay Wells because Ida B. Wells is, I consider her my spiritual godmother. Ida B. Wells was born into slavery in the United States. She was orphaned at a young age, and then she went on to become one of the most badass journalists in the history of our country. She began investigating the lynchings of black men and black women and revealing the real motivations for the lynchings. So in the 1800s, thousands of black Americans were lynched by lynch mobs, particularly across the southern part of the United States. And the excuse for lynching black men was often that they were accused of raping white women. Ida B. Wells would go into an area where black men had been lynched. And when you think about the fearlessness you had to have had at a time post-slavery in the United States, where black people did not have citizenship rights, did not have legal rights, there were black codes, and this black woman is going into communities that had just lynched a black man and asking questions and investigating why that happened. And what she revealed is that more often than not, the accusations of rape were false, that black men were being lynched out of economic retaliation, that typically, or not showing enough deference to a white person, so they were being lynched because they ran a successful business, or they had a farm and they had too much land and they were making too much money and the white people in the town didn't like that, or they were too proud, so a white person told them to do something and they spoke back. You could be killed for that in the South at that time. And so Ida B. Wells went on a crusade to try to get an anti-lynching law passed in the United States. It was never passed, but really to reveal the truth behind why black men were being lynched by lynch mobs. Outside of that, she was also a suffragist, so she was doing this at a time where women did not have the right to vote, but also where the suffragist movement was racist. White suffragists believed if they brought black women in, then they would not get the right to vote for themselves. So they often tried to push black women out, saying that let us get the right to vote, and then eventually it will come to you. Ida B. Wells is not having that. There was a suffragist march in Washington, D.C., and they told Ida B. Wells and the other black suffragists that they had to, Washington, D.C. at the time was a segregated town, that they had to go in the back of the march. So Ida B. Wells disappeared. She waited till the march started, and then she elbowed her way into the front of the march because she was determined that she would not be in the back. So this was who she was. She also was one of the original data reporters. So there was no one collecting data on how many black people were actually being lynched. So you had no idea of how broadly this was happening.
So
and
when was
she
that?
Did that. This was in the late 1800s, early 1900s.
Can we say that data journalism is from that time?
She's one of the originators, yes. She's considered one of the originators of reporting techniques that are still used today. The problem is she was a black woman, so until recently, she was lost to history. Most Americans had no idea who she was. They had no idea about the contributions that she made. And even today, so my real name is not Ida, it's Nicole. I say my name on Twitter is Ida Bay Wells, and people think my name is Ida because they have no idea who she is.
And she had no Excel, no computer, no internet.
She had the mind, which is an amazing computer, but that's all she had, yeah.
Okay, but and I know that I've been to the U.S. last year, and I know about your project.
Yes.
You have the name of your project is Ida B. Wells Society.
Yes.
In partnership with another journalist from the Times.
Yeah. So.
Ron.
Right. So we were founded by 4 black journalists. So in 2016, I helped co-found an organization called the Ida B. Wells Society for Investigative Reporting. Much, I'm sure, as it is true in the United States, I'm sure it is true here. Journalism in general is very white. Investigative reporting is embarrassingly white. It is, of course, the most, it's considered the most sought after type of position. It's the highest position, reporting position in a newsroom. It's the most expensive work because you take very long time to do projects, and so is also the whitest. And so in 2016, a group of myself and 3 other black journalists who understood how difficult it was for us to become investigative reporters ourselves, we didn't feel like newsrooms invested in us, that we got the opportunities to do project work like other journalists, founded an organization to train and mentor other journalists who want to become, journalists of color who want to become investigative reporters. And we named the organization after Ida B. Wells because, for the reasons that I just said.
So how is it working? Do you know how many journalists have you trained already so far?
Sure. So we're actually located at Harvard University, and we have, every training we've had has sold out, which tells me that there's a great desire on behalf of journalists of color to do investigative reporting. They just haven't felt like they've had a way to do it. We have over 800 members, and we have trained over 400 journalists so far. I think the most powerful thing that we have heard is almost every person who comes to our training says they have never been trained to do this type of reporting by black journalists before, and that it is a powerful thing to see people doing the thing that you want to do who look like you and who came from the same place that you came from. We have white trainers, of course, and anyone can join our organization, but it is not surprising to a black journalist to see a white investigative reporter. That's the only investigative reporter they've ever seen. But when you see 2 New York Times reporters, a black reporter from ProPublica and a black reporter from the Marshall Project training you in investigative reporting, that tells you I can do this. There are other people out there who do this work. And so I think that's the most powerful thing. Much like the Freedom's Journal, right? We wish to plead our own cause. We're not waiting for other organizations to do this for us anymore. We're going to do it for ourselves.
Okay, which leads me to a question. How can we do investigative stories about racial inequality in an era where discrimination is forbidden?
Right. So this is, I think, the key component of my work, and probably what I hope will be useful to those of you who are reporters here who want to do more reporting on racial inequality. For a long time in the United States, we have every study that says no matter what indicator you're looking at, black people are on the bottom. School quality, housing quality, employment, health, location to environmental toxins, incarceration. There's nothing you can measure. Okay, there's one thing you can measure that black people don't do worse than white people. Do you want to know what it is? Anybody? Osteoporosis. Okay, that's it. I've looked. So anything else that you measure, black people do worse. Maybe somebody should investigate why osteoporosis, I don't know. But, so that's not surprising. But a lot of times the reporting would say, you know, black people are 10 times more likely to be incarcerated, and it ends there. So we report on the disparities, but we don't look at how are the disparities continuing. Because I think most reporters came to think that it was all just a legacy of our past, or it was all related to poverty, not race, which I hear is a big problem here as well, that everyone wants to believe that the disparities are about poverty and not race, as if we don't know why black people are the most poor. They were brought here to be enslaved, like clearly. So I think that my work is aimed at showing a lot of the, yes, the legacy of our past is important, but that people are making decisions right now that maintain inequality. Now, in 1961, they would say, we aren't letting black people in this school. We won't sell you this house because you're black. You cannot say that anymore because it's illegal. That doesn't mean that people aren't still making decisions in the same way. They're just smarter about how they do it. So I think that journalists who want to write about racial inequality cannot be caught up in proving intent. You cannot rarely prove intent anymore. You cannot have the email that says, I'm doing this because I'm racist. What you can do is show the actions. Show all the actions and then say, is it plausible that someone could take all of these actions and not know that they were going to disproportionately harm black people? If you build all of the affordable housing or the public housing, do you guys have public housing here?
Yeah.
Okay. If you build all of the public housing in poor black neighborhoods, it is not surprising that all poor black people are going to live in poor black neighborhoods. If you never build it in a rich white neighborhood, it is not surprising that those neighborhoods will remain segregated. Someone makes those decisions. So you look at the pattern of decisions, and then you say, clearly one knows that if you do this thing, you will get this thing. I think that is the way that I try to do the reporting. And I don't need to know what was in your heart or your mind, which Americans are obsessed with. I don't know if that is as big of a deal here. But it's not important whether you hate black people or not. The analogy I always give is, if you're writing about ExxonMobil has a spill in the Gulf, you don't care if the head of ExxonMobil hates ducks, right?
No.
You don't care. You don't care how he feels about the ocean. What you care about is, did he not do certain things that he knew could lead to this spill? And it doesn't matter how he feels about the environment. It doesn't matter how he feels about any of that. It only matters, did he do things that predictably could have led to this spill or not do things? That's the same way that we should be covering race, right? When public officials make decisions about, in the United States, poor black schools get the least resources. They get the least qualified teachers. They're less likely to have college prep curriculum. Someone makes that decision. That's how you can reveal those stories. And I think that journalists need to stop worrying about how someone felt and whether someone felt racist, but where their actions racially discriminatory.
Okay, let me talk to something now, bringing to Brazil.
He was worried my answers might be too short. That's not a problem.
No, speak. You don't speak too much, you speak. No. So, trying to make a comparison. Brazil and the United States, we both had slavery, so the ships came from Africa. Some went to North America, others came to Brazil. In the United States, you had the laws, mostly in the South, the Jim Crow laws that forbidden. And now you don't have any more of these laws, no segregation, interracial marriages. Okay, would you? I know you don't know you don't know too much about Brazil. You've been here for 24 hours, but about America, would you say that you're better now, or racism is still a big issue in the United States? And then let's try to compare with Brazil.
So,
I know you will say
you're not slave. I'm not a slave, so that's an improvement. I think when it comes to racial progress, we spend far too much time trying to say, are we better than we used to be, instead of saying, are we where we should be? Are we right? So My father was born into legal apartheid. He did not have full citizenship rights in the country of his birth, but he wasn't a slave. But that doesn't mean that he should have been grateful not to have been a slave, because we should have never had slavery. We should have never had apartheid. So to me, the question is, do we have equality or not? It doesn't matter that things are a little better than they used to be. If you look at every, again, measurable statistic, black children in the United States today are as segregated as they were in 1972. If you look at mass incarceration of black people in the United States, there are more black men in prison than were enslaved during slavery. If you look at almost anything that you can measure, housing segregation, particularly in the North, it is identical to what it was at the time that the Fair Housing Law was passed in 1968. So, yes, we've made progress. When my father was born in a cotton field in a shack because the hospital in his town did not serve black people, I was born in a hospital, right? He could not have imagined that he would have a daughter who would work at the New York Times. But I also can go to Mississippi right now and find people who are just as poor, who are just as disenfranchised, who are just as powerless as they were when my dad was a child. Oh. So I think when you look at your own country, you mark the progress by the equality that you have or you don't have. I know enough to know that in almost every measure, just as in the United States, the people who are forcibly brought here as chattel are the people who are the worst in terms of incarceration, in terms of education, in terms of wealth. When you look at who runs this country, it is the opposite of the demographics of the country. So what that tells you is, yes, there has been progress. No one is enslaved except those who are incarcerated, which are also disproportionately black. And in the United States Constitution, when we barred the practice of slavery, we said except for those who have committed a crime. So what is progress for the people who have never had equality? What is enough? Enough is when you can go through your country in which you are a citizen and be treated exactly the same as those who are white. And until you have that, when Brazil, of course, becomes the last country in the Western Hemisphere to end slavery, we also know that former Confederates actually moved to Brazil after the end of slavery in the United States because they wanted to maintain slavery. So some of them came to Brazil. When you think about that history, Brazil brought more people of Africa than any other part of this world. How can one think that you will ever be purged of that? There was, just like in the United States, no reparations at the end of slavery. It was not as if black people in this country were paid for all of those years of stolen labor. So it should be completely unsurprising that the black population here is the poorest and most disenfranchised. It is perfectly predictable, and I would say as unacceptable as it is in the United States. The difference is, I don't know if it should be easier or harder to solve in a country where black people are a tiny minority, or in a country where black people are a plurality or majority, I guess, depending on how many of y'all claim your blackness.
Based on
sure
Brazilian census, we have 30% of black and 30% of white, and the other mixed.
Right.
So, is not that? From the last census, 50 declaring to be black. Okay, but that's what I mean. If you take out the pardos and only black will be 30%. Quanto? Okay, so I have here Toledo, which helped me with data.
You are in a room of journalists. Get your facts right.
13% declare themselves as black. So if you take out pardos and take only blacks, Brazil would be a country with only 13% of blacks. Is that true?
So
you know that it's not.
So if the measure were not self-identified black, but people who have African ancestry, what would it be? No.
They
What percentage would
can
it
say
be
they are
if we
pardos.
said-
They can say they are mixed.
Right, but if you added every Brazilian who had known African ancestry, what would the percentage be?
8.2%.
Ooh. It would have to be high.
I'll explain it to you. So, like,
Blacks, 8.2.
African ancestry, meaning
40.
you have an ancestor from the continent of Africa.
Oh, so many numbers.
she's asking how many people in this country have some type of blackness in their blood.
Right.
Okay, so Toledo,
African
joining blacks and pardos,
Ancestry.
The answer
55%.
55%. I still feel like that may be low, but who am I? You know, whatever. I'm just an American. So, I mean, this is the fundamental difference between Brazil and the United States. Brazil, or the United States, which was colonized largely by the English, had a one-drop rule. If you had one drop of black ancestry in the United States, you were considered black. There's no in-between. You either white or you're not. And so we are also very mixed. We are just as mixed as you all are here. When you genetically test black Americans, 1/4 on average, they're 25% European on average. But every one of them would call themselves black because you had no choice. There was no in between. Now, on our census, you are allowed to choose more than one race, but still, the percentage of the black American population who would call themselves mixed is very, very small. It's not even 10%,
okay.
Which is different from here. I don't know which is better, because clearly the notion of a one-drop rule is completely white supremacist, because what it says is one drop taints all the whiteness. That's not a good rule, because you could be 99% white and still be called black, which is just silly. But there is a power also in the United States in saying we are not going to divide you out because you have white blood, that we are all in the same struggle together. We are all treated the same. And so you being lighter skinned is not going to make a difference. And there's also a power in that, though it's based in white supremacy. So.
Okay, so now let's move a little bit to politics. 10 years ago, United States elected the first black president. Now, Donald Trump is the president of the United States. Mm-hmm. What happened in between?
Well, how much time do we have left? Listen, if I were to say the election of Donald Trump was not surprising, I would be lying, clearly. For a host of reasons, most Americans did not believe that Donald Trump would become president. With that said, if one understands history and race in the United States, it is not surprising. There was a tremendous racial backlash to President Obama, to this country electing the first black person to the presidency. You think about what that means in a country that is 13% black, founded on slavery, implemented slavery 140 years before we even declare our independence from Great Britain, people who are considered untouchable, people who were considered so tainted that there were laws that said in court a black and a white person can't touch the same Bible, that there were laws that said a black person cannot pass a white person in their car on the street, that there were black and white parking spaces, that black people were not allowed to go to the library that their tax dollars paid for. When you understand a system constructed around black people being that inferior, to see a black person rise and ascend into the highest office in the land was traumatizing for a lot of white Americans. I did a story right after the election because many white journalists were perplexed, and we wanted to believe that racism had nothing to do with Trump's election because many of these white people voted for Obama before. If one studies race, one understands that white Americans have always been willing to see past their racism if they saw it in their own best interest. President Obama gets elected at a time when we have we have been in 2 wars. Our economy has tanked. We are facing the worst recession since the Great Depression. The auto industry is on the verge of collapse. The housing industry has collapsed. I mean, honestly, what do white people have to lose? Not a lot, right? So it is in this area that Obama gets elected, but still by a minority of white Americans, which we also forget. President Obama wins because there was unsurpassed turnout. The black people voted at highest rates in the history. They outvoted every other racial group. The majority of Latinos voted for Barack Obama. The majority of Asians voted for Barack Obama. And less than half of the white population voted for Barack Obama. So if you understand that it was clearly the changing demographics of a country, white voters seeing the power of a multiracial democracy where you have a coalition of non-white people joining with a minority of white people can put a black man into office, the backlash is totally predictable.
So you would say it's like a kind of revenge?
I wouldn't say it's a revenge. I would say that when you look at the polls that have come out, what white journalists keep insisting on calling economic anxiety is in fact demographic anxiety. And these voters are telling you this. The country is changing. We want a time that was past where white dominance was clear, right? Like the economic argument doesn't work because black unemployment is double that of white unemployment. Black wealth is 1/10 that of white wealth. If anybody were to vote on economic anxiety, it would be black people. 90-something% of black people voted against Trump. What we saw were people who see a country that is changing. Donald Trump was speaking to their anti-immigrant fears, their anti-Muslim fears. Make America Great Again is clearly a throwback slogan to make America be like a time when all of these people didn't have all of these rights. It's very predictable. So I interviewed a bunch of white voters who voted for Obama and then voted for Trump. And what they told me was, one, when they voted for Obama, they thought they'd never have to hear about racism again. We have elected a black person. We don't want to hear any more complaints. We have solved the race issue. Then Black Lives Matter happens, right? So while we have this educated, Harvard-educated black couple in the White House, black people are laying down in the streets protesting because black people are getting killed. That was making them angry. They said, you have these rich black people in the White House and you're complaining that racism still exists. We thought if we voted for him, we would be done with this, and we're not, and they were upset. And they said Donald Trump allowed them to say all the things that it was no longer okay to say. They could say that now, and they felt free. Many of them didn't believe he was going to do all of the things that he promised to do, but they felt like he was giving them their status back. And that, to me, in the history of America, makes perfect sense.
Okay, so based on what you just have said.
He also didn't win the popular vote, by the way.
Yeah, he didn't. But based on what you just said, and we cannot talk about Trump without talking about fake news, okay? So Trump
We were told yesterday not to use that term.
Oh, yeah, okay, F news. If it's news, it's not fake. So F news. Trump was elected maybe with collusion with Russia.
I have no comment on that.
You have Robert Mueller's investigation. We have midterm elections in November. So the Democrats can take power again. Do you think that if there's a change in Congress and Robert Mueller's investigation turns out to say that he was guilty for collusion in the elections, he can be impeached?
So one, I'm not a political reporter. I'm not a political scientist.
Yeah, as a citizen.
And I've learned that if you want to look foolish as hell, try to make a prediction about what's going to happen in the election. Or after. I think we have no way of knowing, and I'm not going to try to take a guess as to what's happened. I think what's clear is we're in a period where it seems almost every norm is being broken. I think we can't say how anyone is going to act in Washington, D.C. right now, and we can't say how voters are going to act, and I'm not going to try to pretend that I know.
Okay. So another thing, last year, the Me Too movement began with a story published by the New York Times. The producer, Weinstein. So, no. The Hollywood producer. So do you see this Me Too movement growing to other countries? Like, we had the cases in South Korea, a guy killed himself. In Brazil, do you think it can happen? It can spread to other countries? What does the Me Too movement mean to the United States, and can it influence other places?
I mean, yeah, it can. Again, I can't predict what will happen, but I think it was a powerful moment, and hopefully an ongoing powerful moment in the United States, where women, many for the first time, were speaking up about the harassment that is just so commonplace. I think that to have women in media and the professions that see ourselves as the watchdogs of other people doing wrong, to find that so many of us were doing wrong, I think has been just incredibly illuminating and distressing and not surprising. But yeah, I would imagine it could spread to other places. I would hope that it would, but who knows? I mean, there's a lot of shit happening in the world right now. Every day, I think folks are just exhausted with news and what is going on, that who knows what will take off and what can be sustained. Also, a big part of it, I think, is, we as the media like to move on from things very quickly. There's still Black people being killed by police. There's still Black Lives Matter movement. There are still women who are coming out with stories of harassment, but you're not seeing much coverage of that these days. And we wield a tremendous amount of power in determining whether these stories continue to be told and whether these movements continue to get oxygen. And I think many of us have moved on.
Okay. Now, going back to your work, I know you are writing a book. You are on a leave on the Times. And what's your book about? Can you tell us first of all, what's the title of your book?
If anybody wants to know why, after this talk, I'll be drinking lots of liquor, it's because I'm writing a book and it's the worst decision of my life. My book is on school segregation in the United States. It's tracing the fight for educational equality for Black children, going all the way back to slavery, when it was against the law to teach Black children or Black people to read, and making the argument that our schools today are not broken, that they are operating as designed, that it was never intended for Black children to receive the same education and to be able to compete with white children, and so they never have. The book is called The Problem We All Live With. It's named after a famous painting by a great American painter named Norman Rockwell, and the painting depicts a 6-year-old girl named Ruby Bridges, who became the first Black child in the South to attend a white elementary school, and who was had to be guarded by U.S. Marshals because every day a white mob was threatening violence and was trying to harm her to keep her from going into the school. So that's the name of the book. It's named after that painting of the first Black girl in the South to attend an elementary school.
So where was the field for your book? Where did you go?
So the book is about the whole country, but the main narrative of the book is the city of Detroit in Michigan, in the United States. Detroit was one of the great American cities. It was the third largest city in the country at one point. It is now the poorest and the blackest city in the United States. It's been decimated, and its school system is considered the worst and lowest performing public school system in the country.
Voltando aqui, a gente vai receber as perguntas por escrito, tá? Então, se vocês tiverem perguntas, vocês podem encaminhar aqui para os voluntários. E, por favor, os voluntários podem já recolhendo as perguntas para a gente poder já começar nossa sessão, porque a gente já está se aproximando das 6 horas e a gente não vai ter mais muito tempo. So, speaking a little bit more about your book. So you were talking about Detroit. You've been there for 1 year?
Yeah, I've been reporting from there for a year.
So people say Detroit is a comeback city. Do you think it's gonna ever happen? And do you think Detroit would be an example to what is America, because people normally think that America is a rich country, that poverty is not an issue in America. We live in Brazil, we think that America is good, and then most of Brazilians go to live in the United States because they search for a better life. But we see problems in the United States, just like we have here, education problems, health problems. So maybe not talking only about Detroit, but talking about America. There is another America, the B side of America, that we normally don't know. What is that? What America is that?
My America. I mean, America is at once one of the wealthiest countries and also one of the most unequal countries. There's a reason why we call slavery our original sin. We have never been able to be the full democracy that we have said that we are, because for the first 300 years of our democracy, a fifth of the population was held in bondage. And after that, another 50 years of legal, or really about 100 years of legal apartheid. I think when you think about America, what is important to understand is I'm 42 years old, and I am the first generation of Black Americans who have had full rights in the country of our birth. First generation. We have only had full citizenship rights for Black Americans in the United States for 45 years. When you think about that, then it is not surprising that there's still so much inequality, because the way that we get those full rights is because of a 20-year bloody civil rights struggle where hundreds of people were murdered, where people were brutalized. Our country fought very hard against giving rights to people who have been born in this country for generations. So the part of America that I cover is the part of America that most of you will never see, but also most white Americans never see as well. These are people who have generationally been deprived of access to quality housing, who are generationally deprived of the ability to earn a good income, who have no wealth because of our racist housing and lending policies, people who have never attended a quality school. These are the people whom I write about, and I think that when you look at where the United States stands on nationally with other Western democracies in terms of our education levels, in terms of our quality of life levels, it is the conditions of Black people and increasingly Latino people in our country that leads us to be so low in many of these indicators. Because of all of those Western democracies, we are one of the only ones that is as diverse as we are, and that had the practice of slavery on our own land. So, of course, Great Britain was heavily invested in the slave trade, but they did not implement slavery in Great Britain. France, you look at all of those countries, we, much like this country, after we ended slavery, the Black people were still there. You couldn't just move on from it. We were still in that country that enslaved us and had to be dealt with. And the way that we were dealt with was to be completely marginalized from the benefits of the country. So I think it is, when you go to a place like New York, you go to Manhattan and you go to Times Square and you go see the Statue of Liberty. But if you drive just a little bit north, you'll see federal housing projects in entirely poor communities where people earn an income of $20,000 a year in the richest country, in the richest city in the world.
Ruim aqui é ruim lá também, né? Bom, we are running out of time, so I have a lot of questions here, so I'll try to use them as much as I can. Ok, so vocês podem botar o nome também, tá? Eu posso falar quem fez a pergunta. Do you think that the civil rights movement put the United States ahead of Brazil in racial issues? Maybe you don't know Brazil so much, but you can comment on that?
I think in general, when I visit other countries that also had a history of slavery, that Black Americans are more advanced because we did have the civil rights movement. I think many other countries that I have visited have never had that kind of sustained movement. for equal rights. But I think when I also look at the statistics of Brazil, of black Brazilians and black people in America, they're very, very similar. So there might be more of a political power that black people have in the United States, but it has not done enough to change the actual conditions that black Americans live in. And if you think about Dr. Martin Luther King, at the time of his death, realized the limits of seeking political power, right? So he spent so much effort trying to ensure black people had the right to vote so that black people could elect their own politicians to look out for their best interests. But it did nothing about the economic poverty that most black people lived in. And so what he realized is having the right to eat wherever you want doesn't do you any good if you can't afford to eat there. And I think that's what we have in the United States. Seems like that is what many black Brazilians face as well, is you have political rights, but without economic empowerment, those rights do you no good. You still can't go to the white schools, you still can't move into a white neighborhood, and you still can't go into many of the places that white people frequent, even though you have the right to do so.
We have a lot of questions, okay?
Sorry.
So try to be concise.
One sentence.
So another question from Paola. So you have spoken about the reports that made you feel proud, but those reports are about the black community. Were there investigative reports which you specifically wrote about black women? What was the repercussion of those reports?
No. So I've never done anything specifically about black women. I write about typically black families and the black experience in general.
So how can we transpass the barrier of racism in the words we choose to... How can we transpass the barrier of racism in the words we choose to write our articles? Example, when your editor decides to call a criminal and not a suspect a black man involved in a homicide. Difficult question. Well, I think he's talking about wording. If you put the right word to refer for someone, when your editor decides to call a criminal and not a suspect, did you get it?
Yeah.
I didn't.
I mean, so one, and we were discussing this earlier, you should never say the race of a suspect unless it is germane to the story. If race had something to do with the crime, then you mention the race of the person. If race had nothing to do with the crime, then the race of the person is irrelevant. If I'm black and you're black and I kill you because you're dating my boyfriend, then my race had nothing to do with that. If I kill you because I don't like dark-skinned black people or light-skinned black people or whatever, then, or I kill you, you're white and I'm black and I kill you because I don't like white people, then it's relevant. But other than that, it's not. I do think in general in the United States, and I would imagine here, we give way too much deference to police. We write stories particularly about black people who have been accused of a crime as if they have done the crime without enough of the benefit of the doubt that I think that we should do, and I think we need to be much more careful.
Okay, another question. That's about you, okay? From Yasmin Hestam. Usually, journalists seek a distance between their personal lives and their work, their coverages. Curiously, you have got an article that talks about your daughter and the fact that she went to a low-income and segregated school. As an investigative reporter, how representative, important, and how dangerous is it to expose yourself in this way?
I would not recommend it. I tell journalists, particularly younger journalists who are trying to establish themselves all the time, don't do what I did. One, I've been in my career a long time. It was a calculated risk that I made with my editors, but I think generally, I don't believe in objectivity. I think none of us are objective. If you don't have an opinion on something, you don't know enough about it to have an opinion, and as soon as you know enough about it, you have an opinion. What is important, though, is everyone does not need to know what you think about the things that you cover. You need to be fair. You need to be accurate. So it was a difficult decision to write a personal story about something that I cover, but at this point, I also felt like anyone who reads anything I write knows how I feel about segregation. I think it's bad. So we made that decision. And to be honest, when I pitched the story to my editor, I tried to take it back and change my mind, and he said no. So then I had to write it. But in general, I think it is not a good practice.
Okay, I have another question, anonymous one. Who killed Marielle? Maybe you don't know the answer for this one. So Marielle was a black council member. She was killed 2 months ago, and
I definitely don't have the answer to that.
It's an ongoing investigation, and so far, no answer. In terms of data about race, like our misinformation about race numbers, do you find it difficult to have access to them?
This is both what is good and bad about America. We measure everything when it comes to race, obsessively. Anything that you can measure, we can tell you the racial statistics on it. It also speaks to our obsession with race, so I don't know that it's a good thing, but no. If the data can be had, almost always the data can be had based on race. The problem with census data, of course, and much of this data is it's self-identification. It's not someone, which isn't a problem because you also don't want someone looking at you and saying, you're black, you're not. But when it's self-identification, then that means people can choose. In the United States, our issues with the Hispanic label, because Hispanic is not considered a race, it is considered ethnicity. So you pick your race, and then you pick your Hispanicity, right? And so in the United States, most Hispanics identify as white, though they would not be considered racially white by people who we really think are white. But that's the problem with trying to measure, because race is all fucking made up anyway, which is the whole issue.
Okay, another question. Dear Nicole Hannah Jones, my name is Katia Brazil. I'm a black journalist and feminist. Besides the newsrooms in Brazil, they don't hire black people to leading positions. Those are to black men. I support the equity of gender in the newsrooms in Brazil. In my site, Amazonia Real, we have women and black men, Indians, and Indians and white, I think. How is gender issue in New York Times newsroom?
I think the gender balance in the New York Times newsroom overall is quite good. But as in many places, the higher you go up in management, the more male it becomes. So until recently, sometimes there are no women on the masthead. Sometimes there are very few women in editing and leadership positions. I think the Times is better now than it has been, but it's an ongoing issue. And I would say in most newsrooms, like if you look at who actually, how many women are the editors of newspapers, the number is very small.
Thank you. So the Americans are more shamed from slavery or for the killing of Indians? Or both?
Oh, Jesus. I don't know. I think that most Americans don't deal with either of those things very well. I think we don't acknowledge, the extermination of Native Americans, and we want to act like slavery wasn't really that bad. So I think it's pretty equally embarrassingly bad.
Okay, so...
What about here?
We had both.
I know, but which one are you guys the worst at acknowledging?
We had to be ashamed of both, of slavery and for killing Indians.
Oppression Olympics is never a good thing.
Okay, so in the United States, you have affirmative action. In Brazil, you have quota. So how does affirmative action work in the United States? Are they efficient? And how do you see the quota system in Brazil? So for you, maybe you don't know how it is in Brazil. So in the universities, you have a quota for black and for poor as well, not only for black. It depends on the university. But our system here is quota, and the United States is the affirmative action. So
we don't really have much for affirmative action anymore. So the Supreme Court of the United States has pretty much struck down most quotas are illegal, and most affirmative action is not withstanding constitutional muster anymore. So our courts have determined that after 350 years of slavery, 20 years of affirmative action was enough to fix the problem. So what little affirmative action is left are in some colleges, but the court has made it very, very difficult. So even with affirmative action, Black and Latino students are underrepresented in colleges. In terms of employment, there's really no such thing. I mean, no one really gets bonus points for being a person of color in employment. The court has made it very difficult, and I don't think most organizations really wanted to do it that much. Where it's probably most successful is in government, and government is most diverse.
Ok. A gente está 20 minutos depois da hora, mas como a gente começou 20 minutinhos, eu vou passar um pouco, mas eu vou fazer a última...
The last part, what I think about Brazilian quotas?
Oh, yeah, sorry.
If they are in fact strong, I agree. If you had a population that was denied basic freedom, that was forced to live in unequal circumstances, then what is owed to that population to bring about equality? You cannot say you now have legal rights, but we're not going to fix anything that caused the equality. We're just going to give you your rights and you're free to go on. You have to make up for the harm that was done. And if this is a way that does that, then I'm 100%. We have to own up to what we have done. And I think white people just want to move on, but it's easy to move on when it was not done to you.
Okay. So, last question, okay? So, this is about hate speech. So, recently, in the United States, you had some march organized by white supremacists. Why they are happening now? I think this have to do with the talk we were talking about the First Amendment. Like in Brazil, if you can go to jail because of hate speech, of racist speech. In the United States, not because you have the First Amendment, that it's freedom of expression and people can say anything, even if it's hate. So why do you think they're happening now again? And what can happen because of these white supremacists' speech and march?
I think they're happening because we have a president who has led the way. I think he has made it very clear that certain speech that used to be taboo is no longer taboo. I also think that there are a lot of fears about the changing demographics of our country. Demographers say we will not be a majority white country in less than 30 years, maybe quicker, and I think that there's a lot of anxiety about that, and I think that that's what we're seeing is a resurgence of following the Obama, the changing demographics of the country, and Donald Trump in the White House has led to that. I am a journalist. I believe strongly in the First Amendment. I believe strongly in the right of people to express their opinions, no matter how revolting I may think they are. So I would never be in favor of jailing anyone for their speech, unless that speech is somehow leading directly to violence. And so I certainly don't want to see a white supremacist march, but they have the right to do it. And they also have the right to face the consequences. So after Charlottesville, many of the marchers, or a significant number of the marchers who were identified in social media as marching in those marches, they were fired from their jobs. So they face the consequence for that action, and that's fine. That's a personal choice that those employers can make. But I don't believe in limiting the right of free expression, because when you limit it in one area, you can limit it in another.
Okay, I said it was the last question, but I have a question here that I have to ask because it's important as well for freedom of expression. So we know that there was the killing of 5 journalists yesterday in Capital Gazette in Maryland. Huh? So what do you think it means to press? And I think it's to press in general, because it's not written here if it's for American press or to press in general. What do you think this killing of yesterday represents?
I don't know. I think we don't know enough facts. I think it is not smart to try to put significance behind something when we don't know exactly what were his motivations. We're a country where people going in and doing mass shootings is not rare. We may want to feel like it's different because it was a newspaper, but maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. I do think, though, that clearly when you are in a country where the President of the United States is called the press enemy of the country, who has invited attacks on journalists, that is, it makes the atmosphere more challenging. I know that the type of vitriol that journalists face. There was a candidate who body slammed a journalist and was still elected. So I think we are in a very precarious moment in the United States in terms of respect for a free press, and I can't draw any direct correlation between what we're seeing in the White House and what happened there, because this was a man who had an ongoing dispute with that newspaper for a long time. But I think we do need to be, any democracy needs to be afraid when it feels as if the press is being vilified, because we are the check on the democracy. And I think one of the smartest things that Donald Trump has done was to go directly to his followers through his Twitter account, because he can tell them anything that he wants. He lies hundreds and hundreds of times, and it doesn't matter because they're not necessarily getting the news from journalists. They're getting the news directly from them. And I think that makes, that puts us in the United States in a very perilous position right now.
Okay. Thank you, Nicole. It was very good to have you here. Eu ainda tenho umas perguntas, não deu para fazer todas, mas eu vou passar para ela e ela pode publicar no blog dela. Obrigado, gente. So I will pass these questions to you. If you want to answer, you can use them in your blog.
Oh, on Twitter.
On Twitter.
Or if they want to buy me drinks, I'll enter that.